While the 1950s are remembered as an era of innocence and conformity, the 1960s have become synonymous with change and upheaval. The African American Civil Rights Movement was in full swing, and the American presence in Vietnam was escalating. Along with it, a growing anti-war movement. But the decade began with a sense of hope, inspired by the nation's young, charismatic, and optimistic new leader. 1960 was an election year. The Democratic Party nominated, somewhat unexpectedly, Massachusetts Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who for the previous 8 years had been serving as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower. Many historians consider this election the first modern election, and for good reason.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy and Nixon held 3 televised debates in September 1960. For the first time, Americans could watch the debate as it happened rather than simply listen to it on the radio. Kennedy, tan and wearing a dark blue suit, appeared young, healthy, and vigorous, while Nixon, sweating under the stage lights and having recently injured his knee while on the campaign trail, appeared sickly. This had a great effect upon the audience.
In the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln said the question was whether this nation could exist, half slave or half free. In the election of 1960, and with the world around us, the question is whether the world will exist, half slave.
Now, this is not standing still. But, good as this record is, may I emphasize, it isn't enough. A record is never something to stand on. It's something to build on. And in building on this record, I believe that we have the secret for progress. We know the way to progress. And I think, first of all, our own record proves that we know the way. Senator Kennedy has suggested that he believes he knows the way. I respect the sincerity with which he makes that suggestion. But on the other hand, when we look at the various programs that he offers, they do not seem to be new.
Those who listened to the debate on the radio felt that Nixon had won, while those who watched on television felt that Kennedy had. For the first time, it not only mattered what a candidate said during a debate, but how he looked as he said it. But Kennedy's appearances did not guarantee that he would win the election. In fact, he had several handicaps working against him, one being that he was Roman Catholic. At the time, many Americans were still prejudiced against Catholics, and some even feared that if Kennedy won the election, he would take orders from the Pope. Kennedy addressed these concerns openly, assuring the American people that he would do no such thing. Also, Kennedy was sympathetic to the cause of African American civil rights. This concerned many Southern Democrats, who were committed to keeping the South segregated. To increase his popularity amongst Southerners, Kennedy chose as his running mate Texas Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson. The African American community would also help Kennedy during the election. In January 1960, 4 African American college students walked into the Woolworth department store in Greensboro, North Carolina. After buying school supplies, they sat down at the lunch counter, which was reserved for white customers only. When told that they could not be served, they refused to leave, sitting at the lunch counter until the store closed. When they left, they agreed that they would come back the following day. But they did not come alone. 29 African Americans arrived, asking to be served. The next day, 300 African Americans showed up. This form of protest became known as sit-ins and received the approval of Dr. Martin Luther King, who supported civil disobedience, that being peaceful, nonviolent protest. The sit-in movement soon spread across the South. African Americans walked into segregated hotels, restaurants, and other institutions, demanding that they be served, and refusing to leave until they were. In many cases, the protesters were heckled. They were beaten, burned with cigarettes, and had sugar, ketchup, and other items poured on their heads. But usually, they refused to fight back, doing nothing more than simply sitting at the counter and waiting to be served. Dr. Martin Luther King himself participated in a sit-in in Atlanta, Georgia in October 1960. For this, he was arrested. Just 1 month before the election, Kennedy saw a political opportunity. He called King's wife, Coretta Scott King, and offered to do everything in his power to get her husband out of jail. Kennedy's brother and campaign manager, Robert F. Kennedy, made some phone calls and managed to get King released. In response, the African American community voted overwhelmingly for John F. Kennedy. In the end, Kennedy won by just over 100,000 votes, less than 1% of the entire popular vote. After Kennedy was inaugurated, he introduced a series of social programs known as the New Frontier. These included increased aid to education, health care for the elderly, a Department of Urban Development, and tax cuts. However, many of these measures were opposed by members of Congress, and Kennedy was unable to get them passed. During the years of the Kennedy administration, most of the social reform occurred not through the executive branch, but through the Supreme Court. At the time, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was Earl Warren. He had been appointed in 1953 by President Eisenhower. As noted in a previous lesson, the most significant decision ever handed down by the Warren Court was the case of Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. However, Brown versus Board is far from the only significant decision ever reached by the Warren Court. Two other noteworthy cases include Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona. Gideon versus Wainwright deals with the case of Clarence Gideon, who was arrested for burglary in Florida. Too poor to afford an attorney, he defended himself in court. The Supreme Court ruled that his 6th and 14th Amendment rights had been violated, and ruled that when a defendant was too poor to afford an attorney, the state would provide him with one. Miranda versus Arizona built upon this case. This deals with the case of Ernesto Miranda, who was arrested for kidnapping and was convicted based on a written confession. However, the police officers involved admitted that Miranda was never informed before or during questioning that he had the right to remain silent. The court ruled that Miranda's constitutional rights had been violated, and that from that point forward, all suspects must be informed that they have the right to remain silent, that anything they say could be used in a court of law, that they have the right to an attorney, and that if they cannot afford an attorney, the state will provide them with one. Today, those rights are known as the Miranda rights.